Yes, we can go.
Okay, thanks, Joel. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third panel of the day. It's our second last panel for the Thesis Dissertation Symposium of the School of Environment and Architecture. My name is Madhura Patil. I teach here. And joining us today as panelists and as respondents, we have Dr. Kush Patel and Prasad Kanoka, and hopefully joining us in a bit, we have Sarovar Zaidi. So Dr. Kush Patel, I'm just going to read out their bios for anyone who is joining us recently. Dr. Kush Patel is a faculty member in and head of studies for the postgraduate arts program in technology and change at the Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education in Bangalore. Their research and teaching remain oriented to the theme of survival as both a form and method of historical and theoretical investigations into making just environments across a range of digital and community sites. Current projects include a history of participatory architecture and examinations of pedagogical and archival forms that campus community projects with the digital take to engage struggles against heteronormative and casteist patriarchy. They are also the co-founder of Pedagogy of the Digitally Oppressed, a digital humanities collective that is committed to fostering queer, feminist, and anti-colonial approaches to digital humanities teaching. Their writing appears in Digital Studies, Les Champs Numériques, Knowledge Justice, Disrupting Library and Information Science Through Critical Race Theory, Public, a Journal of Imagining America, and more. Dr. Kush Patel is a registered architect in India with professional degrees and gold medal distinction in architecture and urban design from South Gujarat University, Surat, and CEPT University, Ahmedabad, respectively, as well as a Master of Science in Architectural Design Studies and PhD in Architecture from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Prasad Kanoka is an assistant professor of geography at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology in Guwahati. His research as an academic and urban planner has focused on different urban issues in different cities, including Mumbai, Gurgaon, Portland, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa. His upcoming book from Routledge offers a new way of thinking about slums in southern cities based on a grounded engagement with the relationship between media, objects, spaces, and people in the everyday life of slum localities in Mumbai. His new research focuses on how Guwahati, as a labyrinth of urban circulations in Northeast, where people move through it with different temporal rhythms while using it in different ways. And Sarovar Zaidi is a philosopher and a social anthropologist. She works at the intersections of critical theory, anthropology, art, architecture, and material culture studies. She has extensively worked on religious architecture and urbanism in the city of Bombay, and currently co-runs a site on writing the city called Chirag Delhi. Previously, she has worked on rural development with a focus on health, education, and women's rights across India. And she currently works on religious iconography and modernist architecture in South Asia. She has received the Max Planck Fellowship, the INTAC Fellowship, the IFA Fellowship, and the Koch Fellowship for her research interests. Besides this, she also curates an interdisciplinary forum on art, architecture, and anthropology called Elementary Forms, and has previously taught at the School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi. She currently teaches at the Jindal School of Art and Architecture in Sonipat, India. Welcome to all of you, and I'll just talk about today's panel a little bit. It's called Spatiality Through Narratives of the Everyday. And essentially, through various scales, the panel will look at the sense of how the political at every level and the personal, how authority and individual agency, dominant imaginations and granular impulses and inclinations, all of these are potent forces that shape our cities. And very often their conflicts, it is actually their conflicts and their synergies that produced complex and very often surprising shifts in our perceptions and practices of space. So with that, we have three presenters today. We have Madhura Patil and Nikeita Saraf and Manthan Chandak. And we'll start with Madhura. So Madhura's thesis is about how public space gets built by practices which are often at odds with the imagination of bodies and behavior in the logic of the design of these spaces. Madhura, can I invite you to present?
Yes. Is it clearly visible?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Madhura, and my thesis talks about the narratives of everyday life, a case of Talao, Pali. Cities are designed through logics of standardization and a universal understanding of how they're meant to be occupied. Public spaces constructed through imperatives of efficiency and standards do not acknowledge the spontaneity of everyday life. The concern then arises. Design public spaces are often disruptive and do not encourage the usual practices of the everyday. The aim is to rethink the architecture of affordances of public spaces that will encourage everyday practices and its politics to happen. The objectives are to study a universally designed public space and its nature, to map the spatialities of everyday practices of people and how they contribute to the making and remaking of public space. So the question here is, how do everyday practices shape urban form in case of public spaces and vice versa? I enter the question through conceptual understandings of terms like the everyday, land politics, resistances, public, affordances, tactics, kicks and trips, which are derived from several readings. Lefebvre in The Production of Space talks about everyday life as something that happens at the cusp of far order, that is the planned, and the near order, those are the wants. And Ben Highmore in Everyday Life Reader mentions that the everyday seamlessly accommodates change. Deserto in The Practice of Everyday Life defines practice as creative resistances of people against the dominating forces. Gibson in The Theory of Affordances says that these are possibilities for action offered by the environment, one that is largely designed according to standards. The method was then to collect stories of 6 everyday practices of people that contribute to the production of urban space around one of the oldest lake areas in Thane city. Here, the practices, which were the unit of analysis, were looked at as individual modes of appropriation and negotiations. The larger drawing shows the lake precinct of Talao, Pali reconstructed through thick narratives of everyday practices of people by highlighting the dynamic relationships between different people, objects, and space. It shows how different spaces get warped, allowing the eye to move and find the specific practice in the multiple overlapping practices. These are countering the networks of surveillance by understanding the ways in which the body, object, and space negotiate, which then become the factors of analysis. Practice is not an individual entity, but is constantly being informed by space and is informing the space, thereby producing and reproducing it. More affordances offered by the space make the space more accessible where people can express themselves through their bodies. The practice here is of reading. A retired general store owner who deliberately searches for crime stories, events, reports in the Urdu and Hindi newspapers that he buys to feed his curiosity after he saw a theft investigation unfold in front of him. He buys them from the stall near Talao, Pali that is strategically set up under the shadow of a large tree. This also attracts potential customers looking to stand in the shaded place. The spatiality of where this practice takes place is such that the benches are copy-pasted at intervals along the edge of the walkway, and the trees are carefully placed between them. When there is a minute change of affordance in the space, in this case, the store owner is instantly drawn towards shaded part of the benches to sit and read. The space is also quieter with lesser vehicular movement in the morning and allows him to read without interruptions. The edges of public benches then become shadow spaces. The practice here is of vending. A translator turned tomato vendor sits on the zebra crossing in hopes of finding more Japanese-speaking customers in the city. His tactic to attract more people and also to find people who can speak the language is to include smaller words or phrases while speaking in Hindi. Since he cannot afford a spot inside the market, he sits right in front of it, which happens to be a zebra crossing. This junction sees a huge influx of people and vehicles passing through the area who stop to buy produce from him. With the vendor using Japanese phrases to attract potential customers, the affordance of the zebra crossing increases as space designed for road crossing becomes a performative one, and the zebra crossing becomes a surface marker identifying him. The practice here is of sitting. The footwear enthusiast was diagnosed with arthritis, a chronic illness affecting the joints, due to which she was told to spend some time in the sun every day. Often she gravitates towards a spot that is not shaded and is occupied by a large number of people. This exposes her to various footwear types and designs. In all the responsibilities she had forgotten how much she had an axe of it to. To utilize her time efficiently, she often brings household chores to finish while sitting on the bench near the lake. She buys vegetables from the nearby market and peels them here. The practice of sitting and peeling vegetables, something considered to be a domestic chore, is brought out in a public sphere. The affordance of the public bench increases as boundaries between public and private actions start getting smudged. It only shows that a public space doesn't have limitations and is occupied through the logic of the performative. The practice here is of exercising. Exercising while taking their time is going against the fast pace of business and work. In this way, it becomes a practice that embodies forms of friendship and communication. In the mornings, there are usually fewer men in the area, which is part of why they exercise here. In the practice of exercising and socializing, the amphitheater facing the lake, shaded by large trees, meant to be seated on, is being used by women to stretch and work out. Being less exposed from vehicular traffic and people in general, the space now affords multiple practices. The railing and step seating is being used as support, while exercising or for practicing yoga. The practice here is of walking. A Sanskrit teacher on a daily walk likes collecting leaves to turn them into oils. The lake is surrounded with lush trees like neem and papaya, whose leaves beautifully lend themselves to oils. A practice like walking gives her the freedom to formulate her own rules, where experience is prioritized over productivity. Her practice of collecting is driven through imagination that goes beyond the imposed orders of the city. In the practice of walking and collecting, the city plantations become her own secret garden that allow her to make and remake newer associations by engaging with them. The neem trees then decide the route of her walk. The practice here is of waiting. A now unemployed juice seller sits at the designated bus stop bench to escape the miseries of his home. The bus stop markers were completely uprooted and replaced with a typical bench once the area was renovated on the smart city mission, leaving people a little disoriented on the whereabouts of it. Often people approach him and ask him questions on the buses that come here. In the practice of waiting that arose after the bus stop was uprooted, the man becomes the bus stop himself. The thesis concludes that the city is a product of affordances when the performative disrupts the logic of the standard. Practices become performative when public spaces are used as props, background, and the backdrop, making the city a stage where bodies enact and practices transpire. It is observed that design public spaces produced by planners according to standards and solely meant for efficiency are appropriated by citizens for creative uses. Public spaces designed through frameworks of universal standards are challenged by the everyday practices and appropriations of people as they produce their own space. The question for architecture then is, can the affordances of public spaces be further enhanced to allow for varied appropriations to take place?
Thanks, Madhura, for that collection of people and practices. And you're using actually those people and practices to talk about how, the body is unruly and the body is difficult to discipline. And there are actually in public spaces, there are multiple overlapping, very poetic practices that come from the everydays of these people. And these everydays as shaped and defined, not just by hierarchies and differences, but as you've, illustrated very nicely here, also by all these urges and these impulses that are constantly creatively producing space and looking at transcending the logic of the street and that very particular staid imagination of how a street should function and its design. We'll go forward with Nikeita Saraf. Nikeita is looking at the mechanics of narratives that shape spatial imagination.
1 second, I just wanted to check. This is the first presentation, right?
Yes, Sarovar. You've missed barely 3 minutes of it.
And why did it start before 2 o'clock?
Oh, it was in the schedule, it says 1:45. I think it's all very confusing because on the previous 2 days it started at 2, but our schedule is for 1:45 today.
Yeah, I was like, I just made it. Yes. I'm sorry, Madhura. I was late. I was getting my electricity fixed.
All good?
Yeah, just on time.
Just about. Amazing. Okay. But Nikeita, you'll see from the beginning. Nikeita, you'll present.
Yeah, thanks. So the thesis is titled Narrative Space, Imaginations from the City of Thane. The form in which a story gets carefully articulated becomes a narrative, and these lend to a multiplicity or a multilinearity of space to occur. The thesis aims to open out the mechanics of narratives that construct the imagination of space through history, people, culture, memories, and stories of the city of Thane, located on the outskirts of a metropolis, that is Mumbai. The area of concern draws from the popular narratives of these cities being unruly, lacking, and dispossessed as peripheries of the metropolitan cities. I would further like to speculate how narratives generating from experiences, practices of space can help to shape provocations that move beyond the narrative of land and explore the possibilities of generating them in an everyday. Your language becomes an important tool to mobilize fiction, which speculates the future or a fallback on the past, while understanding the spatial imaginations that emerge from a person's experience. Leonie Sandercock, in her 2003 essay, The Importance of Stories and Storytelling in Planning Practice, writes, in order to imagine the ultimately unrepresentable space, life, and language of the city, to make them legible, we translate them into narratives. The way in which we narrate the city becomes constitutive of the urban reality, affecting the choices we make, the ways we might then act. In this way, stories and storytelling, as well as local narratives, become an important part of city making. The units of analysis here become three texts that were based in and on the city of Thane. A book by historian Sadashiv Tetwalkar, two newspaper articles by Makaran Joshi and Arun Mhatre. These get written between 2016 to 2019, during which there was a political change in the state of Maharashtra. All three authors construct the space of the city through different logics, but the tone of reminiscence and belonging here remains constant. The mechanics of narratives is understood through the following discourses of analysis: the nature of narratives, their source or emergence, the form of narratives, and the imagination or fictional speculations of spatiality. The focus here is to analyze and construct the space of the text and that of the city, which is described through various tropes, and thinking along with them while reading these texts. The second part of the inquiry is directed towards delayering the structure of the written material. Each text will be read and understood through a metaphor of spatial change. Coming to the fieldwork, in the first narrative, the author mobilizes his own experience of his city, of his cousins remembering Thane for the location of a mental asylum. As a response to the demeaning remark about his city, the author charts out a different city of his memories, one that is cradled within it numerous people and cultural events that have shaped his childhood. The diagram of the work begins with a trigger incident that creates a certain reaction and further pushes the tropes of remembrance, of memory, people, transformation, and urbanization. He writes, during that time, it was a town that was eager to transform and grow into a city. There's a certain madness in the city's atmosphere. Every person here who has shaped the culture of the city is filled with the madness of their own. Drawing from words and phrases used in the article, the fieldwork will try to construct this atmosphere through tones. The narrative is conceptualized as a bewildering labyrinth or a continuous trail that creates various pockets where these incidents and networks of his childhood spill open in a certain complexity. The people become repositories of memory and pride, and the landmarks become an identity to uphold the city. The gradual unboxing of these memories creates a wavering and a wandering narrative, as if these thoughts were buried in the crevices of his mind and are slowly getting uncovered, like a labyrinthine experience. The drawing aims to juxtapose the various fragments of his memory and allow the reader to enter it at any point to get lost, much like a flaneur rediscovering a city. For example, in the trope of remembrance, he writes that he remembers the school by the celebrations and the events that he attended there with his parents. He remembers the restaurant by the lake along which it was located, and the theater by the bus stop on which he used to wait. The second book, Spatiality by Sadashiv Tetwalkar, is a compilation of biographies of historical buildings and landmarks of Thane district. He strategizes the book as an archive or a collection of individual objects and their thick archival stories in the backdrop of a socio-political history. The central argument of the book revolves around the concern that buildings and landmarks which have a historical importance are being forgotten, and new narratives and identities are constructed around them. The building becomes portals to enter into history through a lens of melancholy and a need for preservation. Here, the diagram latches onto a linear timeline, unfolding one building at a time, with three types of overlaps happening: of extents, of people, and of timelines. The nodes in the diagram can be looked at as chapters of the book, with jumps in different periods. Each chapter is then encapsulated within a membrane of thick narratives that compartmentalize the chapters into very tight histories of a certain period. The membrane can be pushed, stretched, and pierced through to accommodate these objects of remembrance, which are constantly transforming and reshaping themselves. Here, four nodes of the chapters are opened up. Some get written as a map of events in history which are laid out through the building. Others speak through remorse or forgotten or appropriated landmarks, which can then also be charted out as a mind map, which the author makes for himself, but the reader can also get lost within it. The transformation of a place, in this case, the Thane railway station, is narrated as a witnessed event of the tracks being laid down, to the first train running, and the rehabilitation of the displaced labor. Some construct a changing landscape around old landmarks, using language, names, etymologies to speculate the history of these dynasties. In conclusion, the analysis of each narrative as an individual thesis aided in building up the analytical framework of narrative forms through three main arguments. The first allows the methodology of mapping narrative space. The three authors mobilize or push towards redefining and preserving the space of the city. Their imaginations happen through the tropes which are mentioned in the chart. The table then follows the inquiry towards their mechanics. The first text gets conceptualized as a labyrinth, the second is a constellation, and the third is a collection or a catalogue of stories. The three conclusive diagrams of the labyrinth, constellation, and the catalogue of notes create a logic of a porous experience of the city. When read in comparison to Kevin Lynch's 5 elements of the city, which form clear distinctions between these elements, the elements in the three diagrams create a rupture with respect to reading the city through stories and overlaps, where every practitioner can then define and redefine the city for themselves. The second conclusion draws back to the concerns on unruly narrators. We speak of the urban poor, the abandoned alleys, the place of the squalor, a breeding ground for diseases, by displacement, or a process called accumulation by dispossession, due to large-scale urbanization for producing new spaces to generate capital. Surplus of the global capitalism by the bourgeoisie is dumped into the outskirts, which clears out workers only to reappear elsewhere, thus giving rise to a planet of slums. David Harvey's Right to the City speaks of establishing a democratic control over the right to producing and inhabiting the city with better housing. With this, I wish to draw back and situate the argument within the conceptual diagram on open narratives. With respect to the two ends, that is, narratives of lack and claim, of the debate on urban frontiers, the authors here take a third route, which is a reactionary stance through imagination and language. The third argument aims to discuss the places opened out in the narratives in the light of the trajectory of growth that Thane is following. The cases chosen speak through an area in the city that is dominated by a particular class, and caste, and it has a peculiar sense of living and celebration. It is situated amongst the older mercantile fabric, with pre-colonial dilapidated and low-rise buildings that are appropriated or retrofitted. While the popular narratives to whom these cases react omit the historical area and write through the dispossessions of land and living, both the tropes miss out on the industrial fabric of Thane. Abandoned industries and workers as residents, which once housed migrants, are now being redeveloped. Inner parts of the city are cropping up with real estate projects. These areas fuse all the three parts of the debate, bringing together dispossessions due to redevelopment, claims due to the industrial anchor, and the pre-colonial landmarks of Renaissance. While the reactionary stance of the authors identify the problems with popular narratives, the question here is about how to engage with these urban fabrics of collective memory, while also without getting into the narrative of preservation.
Thanks, Nikeita, for very sensitively through that review arriving at that question, and for really helping to look at how space is constantly being constructed by the narratives of its practitioners, and beyond that, beyond the practitioners and inhabitants, also by the people who write spaces through lenses of history and fiction, but also event and anecdote. And it's really looking at how stories make a space, how experiences and projections, whether they're fictitious or real, all of them accumulate to build something, this super narrative almost, that is in constant flux, that shapes experiences, nudges behavior. And what does that mean for intervening in historical places like this? We'll go on forward and look at Manthan. And Manthan is looking at interstitial spaces in urban form and how they create an affordance, how they create various affordances for a variety of everyday practices. Manthan, would you like to present now?
Yeah. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Just a second, there is some issue. Yeah, I'll start. Hello everyone, I am Manthan Chandak, and my dissertation, Life of Interstitial Spaces, talks about the numerous shifts the city has observed, not only through a conceptual perspective, but also morphologically shaped by changing practices. With time, newer and different methods of studying and planning urban spaces have been adapted, but still, the primary focus is on the built environment, leaving out the in-between or gray spaces. For this purpose of study, I consider these spaces to be interstitial. The trigger for this research emerged after observing a negligence towards the life happening between buildings while understanding the urban fabric of a city, leading to different lives being produced in older and newer parts of a city. The aim is to articulate the most ideal form of interstitial spaces which produce the most interaction. The objective is to define new meanings for interstitial spaces while adding to the existing understanding of them, and to understand the spatiality of interstitial spaces and the life they can afford and produce. And so, to begin with the inquiry, what is the role? And so I begin with the inquiry. What is the role of architecture of interstitial spaces in shaping urban life and space? I enter the question through the conceptual understanding of interstitial spaces as non-designated open spaces between buildings that are not recreational spaces, but they act as extensions or continuums to inside spaces. The research is mobilized as a fictional chase sequence narrative, following the life of two actors in different developments in the city of Nasik. Ram enters Saraf Bazaar, which is an organic development, and Kedar enters Advait Colony, which is a plotted development. They try to locate themselves in different swatches of interstitials, and through the actions, they highlight the differences between the two developments. So I'll start with swatch one. Ram enters the tight Saraf Bazaar street on his Hero Honda. Saraf Bazaar is an organic development located in Older Nasir. He sees two rickshawalas arguing for space so the rickshaws can pass. He knew he should have parked his bike outside the main road instead of bringing it in the visually crowded Murlidhar lane. But it was too late to take a U-turn and go back as four two-wheelers had already queued up behind him. The vegetable vendors had left no space for the rickshaws to pass each other. Ram stopped his bike and expected the traffic to clear and free up the street. While he was standing, many hawkers approached him trying to sell their wares. As the vegetable peddlers moved aside and gave space for rickshawalas to move, the traffic cleared. The dead facade of the old building was used to hang tarpaulin sheets. They set up their shops on the edge of plinth of abandoned walls. The smells of multifarious foods sold alongside the street filled his nose as he rode across them. The vendors arranged their goods along the street edge in such a way that felt like an exhibit kept for the passerby to interact with. The pedestrian, hawkers, vendors, food stall, goods from shops, and randomly parked vehicles rendered a very narrow, awkward, and thin street. Ram accidentally bumped a pedestrian with his bike's mirror who was standing near a food stall. He got into a verbal fight with the pedestrian. The commotion provided entertainment to the people around as they sat there leisurely after work. Ram was barely surprised as this was a frequent occurrence in the street. Now it's the side two. Kedar rides behind his son, who is taking him to work at Omkar apartment as a security guard. Breaking away from the busy road, the noise of vehicles and horns fade away. As they enter Advait Colony, a plotted development in New Anasik, they undergo a canopy by the trees formed on either side of the road. He goes and changes into his guard's uniform and sits on his desk, overlooking the main entrance of the building. With nothing to do, Kedar found himself focused on hearing the birds and gathering of leaves. As he gets comfortable in his chair, Mr. Chakradev rushes down as he is late for his office. Kedar hurries and opens the gate for him. As his car leaves, Kedar closes the gates and goes to greet his pal Shan, who is a security guard in the adjacent building. While they are talking at corner of the building, Kedar gets a call from Miss Kamu to watch over her children playing in the parking area. Kedar sits on the park as he watches the children run and chase each other. The children insisted on going to play with other children in the building across the street, as there was very little space for them to run in the parking with vehicles around. After dropping off the children in the adjoining building's compound, Kedar goes to relax on his chair. He hears a vegetable peddler shouting and calling for buyers. Unbothered by the people outside, Kedar waits for his son to bring him his lunch. Now to give you an overview of the rest of the swatches. This is site 1 again. In this swatch, Ram enters a chowk searching for space to park his bike. One can see multiple activities and practices like temporal shops and parking thriving along the edge of buildings. The pockets and niches created along the edge act as spaces for rest, pause, and transactions, creating many overlaps. In the third swatch, the alley between houses, Ram enters the alley to visit his tailor, whose shop is located in a narrow lane. The height of the surrounding buildings create a dark and dingy lane. This configuration leads to very poor light and ventilation. This deactivates the space and it allows for some hidden activities like dumping garbage and a temporal toilet. The next site, Advait Colony. Coming to the plotted development, Kedar walks towards the chowk to collect his lunch from his son. Here, the activities are limited as only specific people are allowed to occupy the edge. Still, one can notice smaller translation practices like setting up temporal food shops and tapris. The final swatch talks about the back margin spaces. Kedar and other members of the building use this space for occasional recreational activities like playing outdoor games and evening walks. But due to the tall security walls, the activities remain limited to margin spaces of the compound without any spillovers or overlaps, creating a disconnect from the street. Thus, the fictional chase suggests that in organic development, the street and its activities become the interstitial spaces, whereas in a plotted development, the side margin spaces and offsets become the interstitial spaces. The physicality of the plotted development leads to lesser interactions as compared to the organic development. The transaction capacity and activities happening in these interstitials mainly depend on scale and proportion. The scale of the street is almost similar to the scale of side margin spaces in a plotted development. The width determines the interactions, overlaps, and connections, while the height determines the light and ventilation of the interstitials. With the increase in street width, the connection and interactions of these two sides reduce, creating lesser overlaps. Thus, for increasing the transaction capacity, the width and height of the adjacent building should be reduced, but there is an optimum ratio that produces the most transaction. Configuration of the edge is the overall form of the street building edge that provides for transactions to happen. The form varies from a straight line in a plotted development like Advait Colony to smaller pockets or niches in organic development similar to Saraf Bazaar. The grid planning results in a straight edge with no pause or resting spaces. Hence, lesser interactions take place. Whereas in the organic development, there is no specific pattern to the planning, creating more pockets and niches for interactions to happen. Thus, for increasing the transactional capacity, the number of pockets or niches should be increased. In the plotted development, the security walls form a hard edge, separating the street and the building. This compounding of buildings prevents activities from spilling on the street and restricts them only through indirect interactions, like from a balcony. Comparatively, in an organic development, there are no security walls, making the edge very porous and permeable. The thresholds of varying thicknesses become spaces for overlaps and spillages of activities. Thus, as compared to a hard edge, a corroded edge has higher transactional capacity. As the buildings are compounded by security walls, the interstitials in a plotted development become private spaces and can be used by specific people only. The interstitials between the two buildings do not get to interact and spill into each other. Whereas in organic development, there's no security walls and the activities spill into each other, creating many overlaps. Also, the sense of security shifts from a trust-based security to security by boundary walls, CCTV, and a watchman. Therefore, the publicness of interstitial spaces increases, the transactional capacity increases. Thus, interstitial spaces in organic development produce higher affordances for a variety of activities as they work in continuums and extensions to inside spaces. This provokes me to think how neighborhoods can be designed and rethink the concept of divided plots to increase the transaction capacity of interstitial spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Manthan. So Manthan is very firmly located in the idea of urban form. And I don't know if you mentioned it, but I think the two neighborhoods that he's studying are in Nashik. And he looks at, the spaces between built form and calls them interstitials. And there's an interesting methodology that he's actually using where he creates these fictional characters. And both these fictional characters are, for him, a receptacle for these findings. And their voice and their experiences builds on the drawing to, actually extract a sense of life and living from a first person account. And, because all three of them are looking at the idea of everyday practices and the sense of life and living, I'd also like to, make a quick note on the way in which their imaginations and their particular perspectives are shaping the ways in which they draw as well. Because for Madhura, where she talks a lot about the practices countering surveillance, and this whole sense of countering surveillance is embedded in the ways in which she's, she collapses the perspective. And for her, the space is built actually by claims made by bodies and objects in this very limited and disciplined imagination of the city, and her drawing constantly challenges that limit and that flatness, and she's able to build a lot of narratives by like mixing up that sense of linearity and perspective. And then you have Nikeita, who from these deep readings of these three texts, and she's from Thane herself, so I'm sure that has only added to the idea of memory and the experience of a space. And she extrapolates these very, very sensitive memory maps. And she talks about all three of them as the constellation and the labyrinth and the linear timeline. And all of them, however, are able to, produce these smaller drawings within the map that these investigations always lead to these nodes which are opened up through the ideas of layers and all kinds of various kinds of time compressed into all of these readings. And then you have Manthan, where you have the large sense of the urban form, which is held in those swatches of his, which talk very, very clearly about the relationship between built form and urban space. And then you have the first person narrative account, which takes you into a more intimate sense of space through the frames that he makes in that graphic narrative. So I just thought that was worth mentioning. And with that, I'd like to ask our respondents to speak. And we have Kush and Prasad and Sarovar. So Kush, could I invite you to go first?
Gosh, the hard task of trying to, I think in the future, we might want to take a 2-minute pause just to be able to synthesize the different presentations, especially when they go. No, I mean, It's all right. And Prasad, if you have anything right to start us off, that's fine too. Or Sarovar. Hi, Sarovar.
Hi. No, Prasad should go first.
Yeah.
Prasad is the youngest.
unauthorized panel. I'm more liberal about my comments. Okay, where is this? One second. I mean, I'll just give some brief comments. So Madhura, the idea of a public space and the kind of actually people that you were looking at, the two things going on. One is, and the term exercise kind of is a good way to understand, the exercise, the kind of exercises that go on in public space, which aren't necessarily about, exercise of becoming fit, right? But there are other kinds of exercises that also go on, exercises of appearance and disappearance, and how much attention you gather, how much attention you have to give away. And the public space in some ways is also an imposition, right? Where you have to make your presence felt at the same time that you want to kind of disappear, right? So the guy coming to the public space constantly, even when the job is not there, is a certain imposition to be in the public eye, right? So the public space can also be an imposing sort of a space for a lot of people, while it also allows and affords for a lot of things. So it's important to see both parts of it. But I kind of like the idea of looking at, public exercises, the ideas of bodies and objects and spaces sort of put together into different kinds of exercises to generate a sense of publicness, which sort of departs from the older ideas of, habermas and those kinds of gathering things, right? And particularly for the kind of people that you're looking at, right? So it'll be an exercise space, a public exercise space, but it's not the same idea of the public exercise that we think about yoga and how it's sort of reclaiming beaches and streets. There are other kinds of public exercises that are also active. Did you say Japanese phrases at one point? That Japanese phrases? Okay. I was trying to figure out where that fits in, but you can tell us later. For Nikeita, there's always this also kind of connects back to the last panel, that we have this force, or sort of we take this as an imposition to redeem the past, right? And that kind of redemption of the past is not for everyone, right? If you're thinking about someone like what, I forget the name, the Dalit poet who talks about sort of burning everything down to, regenerate something new, right? Particularly also, like the idea of the southern cities has sort of become the space for redeeming something, right? And so the kind of literature that you're reading is in some ways to look at, what is to be redeemed in the context of capital and everything sort of changing, right? But Thane in some ways is also a very communal space, right? It has that history of the Shiv Sena, and it's been sort of a powerful space in that sense also. So the acts of remembrance, right? Or the act of writing the city, beyond the terms labyrinth, constellation, and catalogs were interesting, but also the idea of writing out a city for you when you're reading into someone else's work and sort of writing.
We'll give Prasad like half a minute to get back to us.
I don't know what it is.
Prasad, we just lost you for the last 20 seconds or so.
Prasad, you'll have to repeat your last 30 seconds.
No, I was just saying that, that to think about that, capitalism has a very subtractive logic, right? Where what is not profitable is sort of taken out, There's certain different kinds of logics with which the books are being written, right? Which is maybe paying attention to all the details that we don't pay attention to, right? So the form is one thing, which is the labyrinth and the constellation and the catalog, but paying attention to all the things that don't really make and remembrance then becomes a way of actually drawing attention to those things, right? So how does that kind of come together when you're writing an architectural narrative, right? Like the attention in relationship to all the logics that have become residual or sort of disappeared in the city. And interstitial, I was kind of just thinking about the idea of the spillage and the containment and, the difference between organic and plotted. And I'm not sure the organic sort of stands as a term in this case. But to think about the interstitial, which has probably moved somewhere else when a plotted building comes out, right? It's not as if it disappears, it changes its site to somewhere else. And maybe it, to sort of take a little, to think about it in at a sort of removed scale. When we look at Thane in relationship to Mumbai, what is referred to as the periphery in some sense becomes that space, right? So has it in some sense moved somewhere else? And what is that dynamics? But also to expand the idea of transactions, because there are other multiple kinds of transactions. And plotted development has more money being transacted, but the number of transactions might be lesser, right? But also, what is the nature of these transactions? Is a social transaction, is the economic money? So, what are the sort of expand that idea of transaction a bit more in relationship to the space might be interesting. Sorry, thanks.
Kush or Sarovar?
Kush.
Sarovar, okay, great. We'll rotate. That's the joy of rotations as well. No, thank you. Thanks so much, Madhura, Nikeita, and Manthan, for such close descriptions of the texts and textures of everyday life. I think that's something that comes through very clearly in both the way you read your own texts, but also kind of presented them, drew them, and shared those studies with us. I really enjoyed each one of your sort of drawings in that regard, because they really draw you to that very palpable scale of inhabitation. And I think that was coming through in all of the three contexts. So for Madhura, when you walked us through these 6 scenarios, right? Resting, wending, sitting, exercising, walking and collecting, and then juice selling and waiting. As a way to sort of draw attention to how affordances are both understood in relation to each of these different activities, but also in the context of different actors. So, there's a range of people who are part of these stories and the way they occupy space, but also make something else out of it. I really loved, this attention to, I've written it down here. When you, in the context of wending, when you said the person used smaller words and phrases as a way to sort of make that real. I think that's just a beautiful way of understanding that close-knittedness of a particular place and what becomes of it. So thanks for paying such close attention to these different dialogues and occupations. Also, as I was looking and reflecting on your work, I couldn't help but ask, do people have equal access to affordances? And when I ask that question, it is a way for you to then reflect back on how in each of those instances, there was always a purpose associated with the act of occupying space. Even the woman whom you said is able to walk and experience the city on her own terms, there was an act of collecting associated with it. So I'm just sort of thinking, for whom is affordance an accessible experience, and when does it not become accessible, and why? So it's a question which, of course, we can discuss further, but think about access and affordances and how they come together or not. Nikeita, just enjoyed, very, very sort of textural sort of engagement with fiction. And thanks for walking us through a close reading of these words in the construction of the city, in the construction of your analyses, and the construction of space of discussion. What I also loved is how your drawings were relational in the sense that they were topological. They were moving away from the geometric representations of space to certain topological understandings of both how we occupy space, but also how the fictional accounts are relational. And accordingly, it kind of makes an interesting sort of point of connect between texts and, again, the textures of life played out spatially. My question to you is, let me see. Yeah. So you talked about narrative of dispossession. Is it, right? I mean, I think that was the kind of the underlining thread, and then you concluded with how the texts are opening up the possibility, but also to understand ways in which dispossession is being played out in this context. But I was thinking that the texts are also opening up the possibility for dissent. And I want you to sort of think through, as much as you were sort of walking and connecting the dots in relation to dispossession, texts were themselves perhaps representations and forms of dissent. And accordingly, what are the opportunities and possibilities to think about dissent in each of these circumstances or spaces? And, coming to Manthan, yes, you start with you make it very clear that you're interested in this question of interstitial spaces or interstitiality. And as you walk us through these different, what you call them, swatches, it was interesting to sort of see, in fact, I know they were fictional, but they seemed almost real in the sense that, one could begin to imagine that these interactions are taking place and the spaces are being understood. But my question to you is can you label a space interstitial? Is interstitial a provisional relationship with space? Because if interstitial is a provisional relationship with space, then it only exists in a certain context. And that context also keeps changing. And it's an invitation for you to sort of rethink, because what happens currently with your research is that it continues to delve in these or locate itself in these binaries of what you call the organic and the plotted. And you're not able to break out of it because you're sort of looking at interstitiality as something that could be labeled spatially. But if interstitial, and your stories actually reveal that they're kind of provisional relationships, then in what ways might you see a possibility for interstitiality even within plotted developments? When does that become impossible to imagine even in organic locations? So I want to sort of, think more deeply about this question on the meaning of interstitial and interstitial affordances that you're so interested in delving further. So yeah, I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thanks, Kush. Sarovar?
Yeah, okay. So I'm a bit old school, so affordances is not something I connect to immediately. Also, it's this section is called Spatiality. By the way, Spatiality has been spelled wrong in the mark sheet. Through the narratives of every day. I rarely point out spelling mistakes because I make 3,000 of them myself. this notion, narratives of the everyday, to render that into drawings is a complex task. And I think all of you did some interesting things with what you made. For me, what would be interesting is, the first presentation, which I saw only partially of, the how, the notion of waiting, or the notion of loafing, like just people can just be sitting, they would maybe not even be waiting, the work that I usually work with students on this is called Ordinary Affect by Kathleen Stewart. And Ordinary Affect works very fantastically with all of your drawings and your work, research here, because she moves between the kind of the structural to movements to affective realms of emotion and class differences that are playing out in spaces like a street, right? So what she does is she creates this kind of grid of like we can use the term waiting, we can, but that person may or may not be waiting. There could be people who just hang out, like they just sit there. Sometimes you will just like to go and sit in the street, and especially now, with the, people just want to get out of the house. What would also be interesting, especially because you're looking at it spatially, for me, and this is for all of you, is to what happens with a lot of work on narratives is it becomes too fluid. Okay, and so you're kind of like lost, because then this is an issue in anthropology. It's an issue in narratives, etc., theory, etc. Now, how does one hinge this? And I think you have tried. So supposing you had just looked at the life of one bench or one footpath, or looked at the idea of corners and centers within this, so you would have had some sense of, and I don't know how you want to play with it, because you have all the work in your presentations, but how does one render this with fluidity, materiality, structure, form, movement, desire, nothingness, waiting, all of it? Get it? And I feel that you had all the material, but I felt also that because the form of drawing in architecture, it both gives form, it gives some teeth to to the fluidness of things, but it also distracts you from what you went looking for. And here you went looking for narratives of the everyday, right? So तुम लोग पहले दिमाग में ड्राइंग बनाना पहले शुरू कर देते हो, बात करना बंद कर देते हो. I'm just sorry. In your notes, go back, you'll see things which and I really liked this. I liked the fact that this has been done in this form, but I feel that you can grab more teeth on both sides, on the structures and forms side, and on the and somewhere. So another thing that I when I teach ordinary affect, I teach it as part of actually design theory. The final work that okay, can you hear me? My internet connection is unstable. Okay, what would be also interesting is to work with maybe photographs. Have you seen this film called Being Vivian Maier? It's a very lovely film about this lady, and it's a film which I think works fantastically with students of architecture, because so she was a babysitter, and her whole archive was found later, and she used to literally take photos. Like sometimes they were like, her camera is here at a certain level of and she's just taking pictures, and she has thousands of pictures. And And she looks at this idea of the everyday, the ordinary, the street, the children playing, some kid crashing with a cycle into some other kid, and she has a very different texture of looking at the everyday. And it's sometimes the everyday and the ordinary is the most difficult to grasp and re-render because it's so close. And that is, of course, phenomenology, but I'm not giving you a lecture on phenomenology now. So what will be interesting would also to go back maybe to your photographs, and make them speak to the stories and the images that you have finally put together. And I think photography is a very interesting tool still for looking at. And of course, photography is a complicated history and blah, blah, blah. But now with the cell phone, how we take pictures, how many pictures we take, the world's, just also, something about the everyday life which connects to some dogs and spatial distraction both.
Sarovar, can you hear us? Sarovar?
Sorry, what was the last sentence you said?
Something about...
What was the last sentence you heard?
We heard something about the everyday life which connects to, and then that's where we lost you.
Which connects to something in detail to...
We're not meant to hear this.
I feel that... Oh shit, what is going on? I'm not moved. My internet is full. Is everything fine?
Yes, we'll try once again.
Okay. I think this is Prasad is doing this because I was going to do a spatial jibe. तो पहले ही उसने सेंसर लगा दिया फोन. कोई कर रहा है. तो okay. So no, so this like like I was talking about like a dog sitting next to a pan wala or a vada pav wala, something as small as that, or some old person coming and going, or the spot of the sun and the movement of the person sitting. I'm saying that don't get distracted by the spatial map in your head. Keep descending down from it, and you have. I'll send you a small ethnography of a footpath that we did. Just like a 25-meter like walk, and the amount of detail we went into in that. But yeah, thank you. I think my things, and I'm sorry, I don't connect to affordances and actor network theory anymore. I connect to ordinary affect. But ठीक है, वो सब एक ही league में.
Any comments for Nikeita and Manthan specifically?
Oh, sorry. No, I mean the comments are for all of them, to tell you honestly. I feel that like the last presentation, he made these drawings of the cluster, like the clusters, etc. It was distracting me from what he had gone out to study. I felt a little bit, but it's fine. So I think more maybe mixed media of presentation, especially when you're working on the everyday, especially when you're doing that part. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarovar. Prasad, you want to come in right now? No, okay.
No, later. I mean, Sarovar provoked so much, so I thought.
Okay. मैंने वो सेंटेंस बोला कि अब प्रसाद मुझे डांटेगा और वो बंद हो गया अपने आप कंप्यूटर का वाईफाई.
After the response.
Okay. Madhura, Nikeita, Manthan. Madhura first.
Yeah, sure. So I think I will respond to Kush first because he asked, do people have equal affordances? So I feel some people are conveniently excluded from the aspired image of the city, and this leads to some of the affordances being or remaining underutilized. And then this is because I think it is centered towards a particular demographic. Now, these people who are excluded, they end up having the least agency in appropriating the environment. So I think affordances emerge when different characteristics of individuals or their social needs and intentions match with what is available in the environment. And these affordances, they can be objective or subjective, in the sense that objective affordances address the or depend on the planned and planned activities, and the subjective ones are very highly unplanned because they're explored through the user's creativities and skills, and they're constantly in flux. And then moving on to the to Sarovar's question about drawing, I think initially when I started drawing, I drew multiple time frames at, I think, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. But when I saw it as a larger picture, larger drawing, they seemed like they all were in transit or in motion or in a hurry to go somewhere. And this is where I realized that I was not observing carefully or was not picking up on the nuances or the spontaneous moments that probably changed the course of their day. And it's only after persistent visits and casual conversations that I was able to notice these minute affordances and the environmental cues that people picked up on. And they were not necessarily visual cues, but they could be olfactory or haptic and encapsulating all types of senses. And then after this, I entered or started layering this idea of the performative on the idea of the standard or the planned. So I think it was a back and forth process with the drawing, and I don't think it was pre-decided.
Thanks. Nikeita, your comments?
I think I'll respond to both Prasad and Kush together, because I feel like somewhere both of their comments are sort of coming together. So I think while going back to the conclusive arguments that I made in terms of what all of these three authors are doing, and as Prasad rightly pointed out, it is about remembrance and redemption of a very particular kind of a history or a particular kind of a narrative. And in that sense, I feel like it does happen as a reactionary process. And that is where I feel like what Kush asked me in terms of how do these narratives become narratives of dissent also comes in, because the narratives of both of, and I'd like to go back to the conceptual diagram within which I'm trying to sort of frame the argument that I'm making, is that urban narratives are either spoken in or written in tropes of either lack or in tropes of claims. And what these three writers sort of try to do is a reaction to both of these tropes, and they bring out a third sort of a route where they are speaking of a cultural history, but in doing so, they are also eliminating a particular period of industrialization, which is which is now being redeveloped. And so they do miss out, or they do eliminate certain things while pushing forward a particular kind of a narrative. And also the places that they mention, or the landmarks that they mention in their books, are related to a particular area that is dominated by a particular class or a particular caste. And in that sense, the industrial part of the city gets eliminated. So there, and that's why I'm saying that narratives become multilinear, or they have a certain multiplicity, because other than these three routes or these three tropes of narratives, the narratives of these cities are constantly shifting, and there may be more routes that might open up in terms of how these cities can be written.
Thanks, Nikeita. Manthan, would you like to comment with your responses?
Yeah. So I'll start with Prasad's comments. So I use the term organic. So for that, I'll explain history of Saraf Bazaar. So it's a bazaar located in Nasik, and it developed around the banks of Godavari River. So I use the term organic because the settlement developed because of the life around it. Whereas in the plotted development, what happens is that you have those buildings developed and then the life is added to that. So that's why I use the term organic development. And when to answer like how does it change the site and the dynamics? So the dynamics change because like, after looking at these two sites very closely, that's when I like, termed or like suggested that the interstitials for an organic development are these streets, but there isn't any specific boundary key. I mean, this is like, this by this block is an interstitial space, or this by this block. It's more of a blur or a smudge between the buildings and not a specific boundary. And these transactions that I was talking about are basically social and economic transactions of goods, of information, of care. Then coming to Kush, again, I didn't try to label interstitial space. It was more of a provisional concept only, but I guess that did not come out exactly. So yeah, like, it becomes a concept in which the space between the buildings is the interstitial in the organic, whereas because of the compounding of these security walls, that interstitial sort of gets limited and restricted to these side margin spaces, because the house gets disconnected from the street because of that compound and security wall. Yeah, actually I lost you in the last part a bit, like when you were questioning about something to rethink, so I didn't get you there. And to answer to Sarovar, so those bigger swatches, the initial idea was to explain what is the kind of swatch I'm looking at, and then later zoom into the narrative of how that fictional character is occupying and how he is trying to find himself in that swatch. So that was the main concept and idea.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to respond to the three presentations?
I was like the idea of fiction, literary practices, cultural practices, and extra political economy practices. Emerging from places outside the political economy narratives. So I think those practices and the difficulties of holding them in textual form is something which it's a difficult struggle. It's a difficult struggle. It's like saying a joke but trying to explain it. And so how do you do that? No, how do you kind of write a it has to be done in the form itself, and that is why the drawing question. That's why drawing across all the works that we saw, since like really struggling with the one is to struggle with the text also, because architects of course struggle a lot with texts. But I mean, but drawing we felt was it was a way to handle this madness which cities and societies offer, which is kind of which we felt that. And when I say drawing, I mean also practices like Manthan's case, or yesterday people were also presenting of of working with characters and scripts and all kinds of forms. So that's why this experiment of in form, like the demand from an architect to read text similarly a demand from a social scientist to make drawing. It's that kind of a difficulty. How do you kind of work with these complex narratives in cities, and all three of them were struggling with this. More precisely, Nikeita and Madhura. Manthan comes in with his methods, kind of trying to get this fictional character to walk through or drive through and stuff like that. But I feel the struggle is to kind of find that voice and language to work with the mechanics of how culture and life kind of expresses itself and works itself out, and then what is spatiality doing in that, and where is space, and what are the questions for architects and stuff like that. So I think that's where the struggle is, and it is really this problem that not only it's most explicit in this panel, but all the panels are struggling with it. Next panel you'll see it also more acutely, actually. So that problem of language and voice and the form of language and voice is something which on an experimental basis, like the thesis doesn't become a reflection, but it becomes a exploration and experimentation to kind of work things out. So wo wahan par the. So I think that's the I know Nikeita was struggling with dealing with this literary text, and Madhura with all her 6 narratives. Manthan also with narratives, actually. So yeah, so that was a tricky thing. I want to know from Nikeita specifically, like how would you imagine that the fiction, in Thane, for example, the fiction of the city is not necessarily only textual. It is shared amongst people also. Like nobody has read about what exactly happened when Bombay was given by the Portuguese to the British as a dowry for Catherine Braganza. This is always one-line text. This is what happened. But everybody knows the story, and people love saying the story, and then that story becomes so much, and then there are all kinds of, finally it is a dowry, and all kinds of judgments made on it, and this and that, and all kinds of things. So this fiction kind of works itself out beyond text through oral narratives and through many practices, different etchings, different cultural productions, people writing, like the idea of 7 islands. 7 islands is a myth. Bombay was never 7 islands. It was 700 islands, actually. It came in. But this whole idea of 7 islands is like, it's become this kind of a story fiction, which kind of, is spoken about everybody. How does it kind of, carry forward? No, it doesn't carry forward only in literary text, but it also carries forward through many complex ways, like this imagined narratives. They work themselves out in so many ways. So it's like you had a narrative of Thane or Bombay, not through text. Somebody told you kind of describing, projecting, something else is happening. So it's a more complex mechanics in which imagination of the city is built, shared, and also remains diverse. Like almost like a Chinese whisper, kind of going from one place to another place and opening itself up and stuff like that. Yeah.
Did you have a?
No. I was responding also to the the drawing emphasis in the three presentations, and the difficulties, wanting to open up this thing that the form and language and voice question is something which we are finding it difficult, and some conversations can kind of open those directions. This panel, the next panel, I think can kind of orient them into in this, because I think this is the important way in which structures get formed in our for us also. The frameworks get formed for us also. So yeah, Prasad.
Oh, no, unless someone else wants to go, I can wait.
Just have a small point before. So I think particularly when I was drawing and when I was reading these texts, because I have seen most of these places, or because I've inhabited most of these places that are mentioned in the text or that are mentioned in the book, or certain events that annually happen in the city. So there's an event called the Vaipahat that happens on the first day of Diwali. So there's a major market street on which almost everyone from the entire city and the neighboring cities come together. And there's no certain activity that happens there, but it is just a place where you have chance encounters with people, or where you sort of you annually meet certain people. So it becomes like a meeting spot. So when all of these places or all of these events were being mentioned in the text, there was a certain reproduction of imagination that was happening from my end also. So it was sort of like a co-generation of imagination in the sense that was taking place, and maybe that is where the most part of the drawing also came from. So there were things that I was reading, there were things that I had heard from people, there were things that I had experienced, and that is where this completely different place of imagination was getting reproduced through the drawing.
Prasad, do you have comments? Prasad Kanoka.
Prasad is using C network, so he's kind of gets frozen quite often.
I am also using C network. It's working fine.
We're all using it. But Prasad is frozen in this very interesting repose state.
Kush or Sarovar, did you have any other comments?
No, I think I'm fine. I've put some papers for the panelists. You can look upon.
This is a question, and we can
had a look at them.
We can carry it forward into the next one as well. But I think the one place where the theory of affordances and Gibson's reference comes most recurringly is C, and it's interesting because I think it's also one of the physical anchors for each of these spatial studies. And my question, as a question for all of us, is what if Gibson, or the theory of affordances was not really in at the forefront, particularly in thinking about everyday life. Because what I think is happening is that even for Madhura, there were such nuances to understanding and observing the everydayness of everyday life, that it immediately starts, what the limitations of affordances is that there is a certain kind of a physicality that is expected of it, And that relationship is almost always oriented towards identifying what is it about that physical space that allows for certain kinds of behaviors or aspirations or desires to manifest themselves. But it takes away the sort of sometimes, particularly in such close studies, it takes away this very idea of, again, questions of access, accessibility, spaces that get produced, but not be contingent on a specific physical marker. And so it's just a thought question for all of us, especially for the next panel as well. What if affordances was not a discursive framework to think with, at least to sort of anchor your projects initially with, and see what comes out of your descriptions of space and life. Yeah.
Thanks, Kush. I think Prasad Kanoka has joined us from another device. Would you like to come in with your comments?
I mean, I think, there was one thing which I think just a thought that has happened, that keeps coming up since the last 2 days, is that, there's a lot of burden that gets put on drawing to do everything, right? To be able to show everything, but also a lot of burden to sort of redeem something, right? And this is to do with what Nikeita was talking about, right? To think about something that is lost without a sense of preservation, right? And much of what I got a sense of was that the books that she was looking at were just, in some sense, writings about certain places that are there in Thane. And maybe there's no sense of wanting to redeem it, or maybe just a collection of, names and places. So, drawings can do different things, that they can just be a collection of details, and, the process of drawing can direct us towards a way to work with that. But to put so much burden on, drawing to represent everything, to show us a way to, get towards a design strategy, towards doing everything might be too much. So if it doesn't carry so much burden, then drawing can maybe become a medium to do a lot more, to sort of experiment with and then figure out a way in it, right? So the book becoming a labyrinth, in that sense, the drawing can also become a labyrinth to not get somewhere, but to sort of figure out what is going on, and how one responds to it. Yeah.
We have around 10 minutes more left on the panel. If Rupali or Anuj would like to make some comments also.
We can also use it for the next panel.
Can we start the next panel when it's supposed to start?
When
is the next panel? 4:15, it said.
4, I think.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No. You cannot start the next panel early. You can start it late.
Not late. You can start it on time.
4 baje,
4,
4 baje.
it starts at 4
Guys,
o'clock.
I have been running non-stop since yesterday. I just made it. So I just want to lie down for 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, like, what is, in some ways, all of them were working with, one is, in some ways, all of them were also writing the city, no? Like, both working with, I think Kush said it's like text and texture. But also this, in some ways, all of them had this kind of a sense of fiction also in them, like Madhura is kind of looking at particular characters, who have deep stories within them. They're not your usual characters who you draw in AutoCAD, like the universal figure. but these are people who are kind of almost out of step, you know. And Nikeita is kind of looking at really sort of fiction as such, but fiction and its entanglements. And then Manthan was looking at this chase sequence, right? And in some ways, I mean, like this idea of how it held on to a structure of space. I thought that those became interesting anchors, but I think that's a pushes question of if it is not affordances, then what else? I don't know, I don't know, because I felt like those, in each of those cases, like those anchor points became in some ways in which the fiction sort of held on to things, because like what Sarovar said, no, otherwise like the everyday is fluid, like there's fluid, and it's sort of, what is it that holds it? I felt like that structure sort of held it, but that's an interesting question to ask, what else then? And maybe that's something that you can also reflect on in the final panel push. That might be an interesting sort of, thing to open up, new space to open up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hi Anuj.
Hi. I was just thinking, there was a term which came in the conversation, the place of narrative. And I was just wondering that, what is the place of narrative, and how do we inhabit it? And what does it mean for architects to inhabit the place of narrative? And like I'm also thinking through the title of this session, and I'm wondering if it should have been spatiality through narratives of everyday, or narratives through spatiality of everyday. I'm just thinking that do narratives make it difficult to inhabit space, or do they make it easier for us to inhabit space?
It makes it very difficult for architects to inhabit space because of narratives. Very difficult. कि लोग कहाँ से आ गए इसमें? वो क्यों, उनका वो तो होना ही नहीं चाहिए.
Can you elaborate on that?
प्रसाद का शक्ल देख लो. No. So the thing is that one of the things that happens with the form of representation that we work with in the system of architecture, and even also the form of representation is also a form of epistemology and thinking. Okay, so because the form has such a strong presencing, whether it is the plan, the section, or the elevation, the form is constantly in contestation with the real, which includes the human, the narrative, the fluidness, the world. Okay, and that is something which is sometimes deeply recognized by architects, sometimes not recognized, or sometimes there is a sensibility towards it, which I feel that a new generation of architects and architecture students are much more conscious of it than another world. But because the form compels expulsion and exclusion of bada wala speech ho gaya. Because the form is about neatness. It's not even just. So the thing is, that's why we all try and make students do different kinds of representational forms in architecture, right? Whether it is the graphic novel, whether it is the sketching, whether it is, because you want to move them into different ways of thinking of the image as not what is given in the discipline, but as something which is speaking, which is inhabiting, which is moving, which has got light and taste and texture and smell. And somebody mentioned aromas. Aromas are very strongly a part of the spatial, but how much do we dwell on it, especially in a city like Bombay? One of the oldest tensions that has happened in Cuff Parade is the fact that there is one particular time that the smell from Machimar Nagar will come to Cuff Parade, and as big a billionaire that you may be, you will have to contest with that smell. It's not going to go away. In fact, in Kaf Parade, they once put gulab jal in the nalis to change the smell. Guys, this is like obsessive Bombay research. It was there in the Bombay Midday once. So spatiality, what all does the form of spatiality let you include and exclude? And how much is the narrative in takkar with it, right? And how much is the form trying to navigate? Because your beginning is not the narrative. Your beginning is never the narrative. And here narrative कोई वो transcendented ऊपर कहीं घूम नहीं रहा है, वो तो लोग है ना, वो तो movement है, वो लोग हैं. Okay, sorry guys, I'm getting a call from the electricity office. Give me 1 minute on this.
But yeah, okay, Sarovar is gone. But I don't know if form is so kind of removed from the narrative, huh? Like
Yeah, that's
the
what I was
way,
going to say.
yeah, the way she's presenting it. But yeah, let her come back.
But, this is also an invitation for us to think about the non-representational. There is such a heavy emphasis on the representation, and I think Prasad, who's still, okay, I thought he was still frozen, was sort of, inviting us to think. Non-representational theory does sort of, allow us to not privilege a certain kind of mediation with drawings, for example, right? And it possibly opens up different possibilities of thinking about senses more broadly, and then ways in which we could present them, we could think with them, we could make them. And I think some of the projects are getting to do that. I really, really love Nikita's work, because it did the hard work of sort of understanding, first of all, unpacking the very term narrative, but through a very fictional lens, and sort of understanding how that fiction is also a fiction and a reality for the people in Thane. So I think there's a lot of complex unpacking that Nikita was able to do in constructing the thesis. And I think that, again, let's continue this conversation, because there are six more projects remaining, and it would be good to summarize. And can I make a request? Since there are 5 projects, could we break them into 3 and 2 to make sense of all 5 at once? I will lose my sense of notes and time.
Rupali, you're the moderator of the next session. That's
okay. So we turn that into 2 sessions.
2 sessions.
Wow.
Okay. Or at least have a break in between, just a little break.
Yeah. Sure.
2.5. You can.
Yeah. 2.5. Who's that who's getting cut in the middle?
Jatan can start, and like
Jatan is the end.
He's the sleep phase, na? You start with the dream and begin with the dream.
Oh my God, there's Pranay who is getting cut in the middle. You don't want that.
Just stop it after his video. It's okay.
Okay.
Okay, Sarovar has had to leave also. Prasad, you want to say something?
No. I was kind of coming back to the affordance thing, but we can do it in the next session also, because it's already 3:30.
Okay.
The affordance, like for us, just to take 1 minute, like for the like one is like it's the privilege of like you. Like it depends on where you are to kind of the privilege of form. Na? Like text is also a form which is immensely privileged. In like what I think is modernity through its regimes of law and accounts privileged text as a legitimate validating entity. It becomes a language of the court. It becomes language of of legal systems. It becomes language of the state, etc. So text has that privilege, and we kind of keep on going back to it. Whereas there are many other unprivileged forms which enter, which seek presence, which seek all kinds of existences. So that is one part of it, in defense of multiple forms of doing things, and recognizing text as a form. But like all of these guys, the way they kind of spoke about the things, and affordance, we keep going back to Gibson because like one of the key way to kind of deal with form, architectural form, to validate it, to kind of think about it, to kind of work with it, is through affordances. And that's why probably the affordance question becomes so, it comes again and again and again in so many things, like what are the various diverse things that can happen through a form, and how do you kind of increase the affordances of those things. So yeah, I mean, yeah, we'll come back in the next session.
Okay, sounds good. Then we should be closing the session. We'll close the session now. And it's been really great, Kush and Prasad and Sarovar. We brought up, ideas of access and affordance for Madhura, and specifically whether she should consider, since she's considering practices of the everyday, practices of leisure and of nothingness, also the limit to the idea of affordance. And then with Nikeita, we spoke about fiction as, giving agency for dissent and resistance. And also for Manthan, to consider very deeply, the boundaries of the terms within which you operate, especially because your work is rooted in the ideas of boundaries itself. And that took us to, larger ideas of the relationship between spatiality and the narrative, and the sense of the non-representational, and also the burden on drawing. And I feel like a bit of all of these larger ideas are going to come into the next panel. It promises to be very interesting. So please join us again at 4 o'clock for the last panel of this entire year's dissertation projects. It's titled Peripheral Sensoriums, and we start at 4 o'clock. And thank you once again to all our panelists and our speakers. Bye.